Welcome to the first episode in my new series. I really want to make a shift in the channel to more educational content. I want to be able to provide value to my viewers and create a community here that pushes people to learn and develop together, supporting each other and encouraging each other. And I think that transitioning to a course structure on my YouTube will help create that kind of environment. This class that I'm doing here is intended to take you from a complete beginner to an intermediate to a somewhat advanced artist. We'll look at drawing in perspective, anatomy, gesture, design language, lighting, color. And at the end, I want to dive into the business side of art and help show artists who want to make a living doing this what they need to know, the tools that they need to have in order to do accounting for their business, do marketing, and so much more. I look forward to going on this journey with all of you, and I look forward to hearing your feedback so that I can make this content even better and more sincere, more concise, and even more accessible. All right, without further ado, let's jump into it. Okay, so this is the first episode of the new series titled From the Pen of Insomnia. This episode is perspective for artists. So we're going to dive straight into looking at one-point perspective. I have chosen to do all of my demonstrations on Procreate, so it's easier for viewers to see what I'm doing. Please excuse my very poor ability to draw straight lines in Procreate. It's very difficult. I promise I'm much better at doing it on paper. So these are just a few basic perspective grids. This rectangle that I'm creating is what's known as the picture plane. Within the picture plane, I draw a horizontal line known as the horizon line. This represents the eye level of the person looking into the plane. The plane represents the field of view of the person looking in, and the perspective dot, or the single dot on the horizon line that the lines come out of, that is the vanishing point. That's where the center of the viewer's eye is. That's where it all converges to. So all shapes and objects in a one-point perspective space will converge back to that single point. I'm doing a lot of different sketches here to show you how different these perspective grids can be set up. There's no criteria other than that you have a point and everything converges to it. It doesn't even have to be within the picture plane. Although once you get outside of the picture plane, your objects can become very skewed following the perspective lines. So now that we have a very basic understanding of what a perspective grid is, let's draw some shapes within it. So first, picture plane, horizon line, vanishing point, and then I draw some lines out from the vanishing point to represent the grid so I can kind of visualize the space. In one-point perspective, all of your vertical and horizontal lines are parallel with the picture plane, and your other object lines will converge back to the vanishing point. This gives the illusion that it's existing in a space and the viewer is looking directly at it, and it's converging to infinitely to the vanishing point. You can place shapes anywhere within the picture plane, and a useful tip here is your objects, if it's above the horizon line, you'll be looking up at it, and if it's below, you'll be looking down at it. If the top and bottom are on either side of the horizon line, then you're effectively looking straight at the object and you won't see any of the top or bottom. So I encourage you to grab a piece of paper and try this out. It's a very simple exercise, but it helps you wrap your head around how forms are built in space. So that pretty much wraps up what I wanted to say about 1-point perspective. Let's jump into part 2, which is 2-point perspective. So I'm going to start by going along the same kind of structure as 1-point perspective. Here, instead of having a single vanishing point, you have 2 along the horizon line. One is usually placed within the picture plane and one outside to avoid objects being very skewed as you're looking at them. Now, only the vertical lines are parallel with the picture plane. All of the other lines converge back to the vanishing points, and this gives the viewer the idea that the object is turned at an angle. In 1-point perspective, you have to be looking directly on, straight at an object, because the front plane is perfectly parallel with the picture plane. In a 2-point perspective grid, you're looking at the corner of the object as opposed to side of it. So it allows you to turn objects in a lot of different ways and just kind of helps you to understand a more complex space, like in the real world. 1-point perspective is a lot simpler than 2-point perspective since there's only one point where everything converges. I think of 1 point kind of like looking down a hallway and everything is facing directly at you. 2-point perspective is more like you're looking into a room from the corner. So I've thrown down some bullet points here to help illustrate the concepts that we're talking about. I recorded the drawing separate from my voiceover for the sake of clarity. So these bullet points are good things to take note of when you're going and trying these exercises out. So here I'm going to build a picture plane, run a horizon line, and kind of discuss how to draw an object in 2-point as opposed to 1-point. So a big thing to be conscious of here is, like I mentioned before, is that only the vertical lines are parallel with the picture plane. If you keep this in mind, it will make it much easier to know what to do if you're not familiar with drawing in perspective like this. I like to lay out a perspective grid to, again, kind of help me visualize the space. In 2-point perspective, you can see a little bit more how this grid lines kind of represents the ceiling and floor of the space that you're looking at. And that helps to, once you're more advanced, it helps you to make educated guesses as to the perspective of the objects. Unless you're doing very precise drawings, I find usually you'll use a perspective grid to give you an idea of how everything fits into perspective. You won't go through the actual construction of drawing it back to the vanishing points because that takes a lot of time. So a grid is really useful in that application to define the space so you can visualize how objects will sit in it. Doing these simple exercises like drawing rectangles back to your vanishing points in the grid helps you build up your visual library and understanding to look at the grid and see how the objects will fit there. The more this heavy legwork that you do now to understand how things look in the perspective grid is less work you have to do later when you go to work on an environment or a finished piece, because you'll understand how everything fits and you can much more easily look at everything and assume exactly how it's going to fit in. I like to do, for these examples, objects in a lot of different perspectives, a lot of different angles, so you can see how they fit into the same grid and look differently depending on where you place them. That concludes 2-point perspective. Let's move on to a multi-perspective grid. Okay, so taking a look at a multi-perspective grid, some important points are you can have as many different angles of 2-point perspective within the same grid as you want, but only a single 1-point perspective, because the 1-point perspective represents where the viewer is looking and where their eyes converge to. The 2-point perspective is representing the space and how objects are turned in that space. So if the viewer is looking straight on and there's a turned object where you're seeing the corner of that object is in 2-point perspective. And so maybe you have a lot of different objects that are turned different directions. They will all have each have their own 2-point perspective that they follow. Well, I'm doing the demonstration drawing of a few different perspectives here. I want to talk about why perspective is so important for artists, and especially character artists like myself. It's really the foundation of drawing at a high level. It might not seem as important to a character artist or someone who draws figures, but the overwhelming benefit is how it teaches you volume in space. Drawing shapes inside the imagined plane, as I mentioned before, helps you be able to visualize that. So when you go to draw figures later on within a space, you can visualize boxes and cylinders in perspective and then draw the anatomy over top of that. Perspective serves as the building block for everything in art. We can learn different ways to use these building blocks as well. There's different things that we'll look at later when we get into lighting, and how using a perspective grid and understanding the basic shapes in perspective can allow you to understand how light's going to hit very complex shapes and interact with them. Breaking down complex things like vehicles, environments, both organic and like architectural, people, all becomes significantly easier when you can look at a form and break it down into its most basic shapes. And that's really the purpose of the exercises that I'm showing you here, is to understand those shapes so that when you go to draw the things that you really want to, you know how. As you can see, I've done a center point as my 1-point perspective for the objects that we're looking directly at within this picture plane. And I have 2 different objects turned at different angles on different 2-point perspective grids. So you can kind of see how building this up would allow you to have multiple different shapes from different directions within your perspective grid. I think, like I mentioned when we looked at 1-point and 2-point, focusing on which lines are parallel to the picture plane can really help you visualize the space and know what objects should go where. All right, that wraps up the multi-point perspective picture plane. Let's jump into breaking down rectangles and creating ellipses in perspective. Okay, so for the sake of simplicity of understanding, I'm going to do this on a 1-point perspective grid so that you can see how to break down a rectangle to find your key points to creating an ellipse in perspective. So first, I'm just drawing a simple picture plane, 1-point perspective grid, and I'm going to draw a square in perspective converging to the vanishing point. Then I'll do cross lines from corner to corner to find the center point. From there, a vertical line and a horizontal line converging to the vanishing point defines each quarter of the square. Once you've done that, it's just a matter of placing points, one at each of the cardinal directions and one halfway up the diagonal line, as you can see me do here. After you've placed these dots, you can see how the connection of them will create an ellipse, otherwise known as a circle in perspective. And then you just go and draw your circle, filling all of these dots, and now you have a ellipse. Past dividing up a rectangle for the purpose of drawing an ellipse, if you draw so you take the square, you cut it in half. If you draw a diagonal line from one half to the top of the same half, that will divide it into thirds. And that will divide it into fourths. And you can continue to subdivide from there by drawing corner to corner in each of the little boxes. This allows you to take cuts out of these shapes and build up complex shapes within the perspective grid that are symmetric. So I want to show you a practical example of how you use circles in perspective to create a cylindrical object. So first I'll draw a box, subdivide the square like I showed before, and then draw my circle through that. Next, it's just connecting the top visible corner of each of the circles and the top and the bottom visible edge to give the impression of a cylinder in perspective. So now that we understand how to do these basic modifications to shapes, let's take a look at form lines and understand what their use is when it comes to drawing more complex objects. Okay, so form lines are a way to define organic shapes. It can be a rounded shape or it can have sharp edges. Really, you draw a cut like it's a cross section of whatever you're drawing, and then you go through, connect it to a similar cut at the base, and draw the lines around the object that signify the form that you've created. This could be for a triangle, for a cylinder, for a crescent shape like I've done here. The purpose of this is to represent a complex organic shape within space. So in the next episode, when we're looking at figure drawing from the perspective of shape design, we'll take muscle structures and use form line drawings like this to understand how the muscle wraps around the bone in anatomy so that we can simplify it and draw it very effectively and efficiently. Here I have a little caterpillar friend for you all. He can be our buddy for the rest of the episode. A key purpose of doing form lines is to define planes that are difficult to recognize. In academic drawing, you'll see people take faces and draw form lines all over them. This breaks down the planes of the face so we can understand how light is going to hit and reflect on the face. It's a means to break down complex objects into simple shapes in perspective, like we were discussing before. It's also a really great warm-up exercise if you're getting ready to draw something complex. It helps you get your mind ready to visualize objects in space. Quick life drawing of some object. I'm doing a deodorant container that I had sitting in my room. So just starting with a very basic grid, I'm going to do a 2-point grid here. So I'm going to first draw a box to represent the overall shape of the object, and then use the grid method to draw an ellipse and converge this ellipse back to the vanishing point. After that, it's really just adding some simple details and a scribble of text to kind of hint at the definition of this object. I will show some academic studies that I did when I was studying with an art professor so that you can see some more complex applications of these shape drawings. It's very difficult to do perspective drawing freehand in digital software because the inputs of your pencil in the software it doesn't compare to how precise and steady you can be on paper. I think that everyone should learn to draw on paper before they try to do anything digitally, because digital drawing is so much more finicky, I guess would be the best word, and it can be quite frustrating. So I would recommend drawing with pen and paper first, and that way you have no upfront cost. You can just start doing it, and that's a really big part of this. All right, so that wraps up my demonstrations for you. For homework, I want you beginners to go and draw some perspective grids, draw some basic shapes within them, try to construct some ellipses and circles. And if you're really confident and looking for a challenge, try to do some complex objects like this deodorant container, or maybe a wallet, or a pencil, or a pen. Complex shapes can be a really great way to wrap your head around forms in space. So I would implore you to try that. All right. I look forward to hearing from you all next week for our next episode in this series. I have a Discord server in progress, and I hope to have it open next week. Everyone will be welcome, both artists and art enthusiasts, so that you can share your work and get critiques from other artists. And if you like what I'm doing here and you want to support me, please consider checking out my Patreon, where I post exclusive content, or my Etsy shop, where I sell prints and original sketches. I'll have those both linked down in the description. And with that, I love you all. Please take care.